Hello, I'm Janice Karen, Director of Policy, Technology, and Innovation at the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, or MHDC. I run our Data Governance Collaborative, also known as the DGC. We start each of our weekly meetings with a series of industry quick updates to learn about new and proposed regulations, laws, standards, industry initiatives, and other activity. Join us for this week's updates. If you'll go ahead and move to the first update. So starting it off big, Fire version 5 was released on March 27th. We are still working through the changes. I have not actually seen really any good discussions of this elsewhere. So what I did was, just as a starting point, listed new resources that were removed, and a couple other quick things. We will definitely be looking at this in more detail later. I'm not going to read off all these new resources, but as you can see, there's a little bit more focus on the history of things. There's some new nutrition stuff. I do want to mention permission, because when I first saw that, I'm like, well, how is that different from consent? But it's actually interesting, because what permission is that's actually a metadata resource. And it actually is it's basically designed to be the access control resource. So consent is tracking what people give permission for, but the permission resource is attached to a particular piece of data and it defines who can access that data. So that's the difference, if anyone was wondering. The other thing that I want to comment on is that they removed the media resource. For those of you who've been to some of our past deep dives or some other discussions where we looked at fire resources and how to represent certain types of data, the media resource comes up a fair bit, because that actually allows you to include an actual image, an actual video, the binary files that are that image, that audio clip, that video. And it is referenced in a lot of other US core and relevant resources. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. So we'll be looking at that one in particular. I did not have a chance to really look at Absorbit, but there were a lot of changes to medication-related resources. There were a whole bunch of new data types, and they removed a bunch of data types and a lot more. And there was no specific comment, but I will tell you right now, this is not backwards compatible. It's not in any real way, at least not generally backwards compatible. There certainly are likely portions of it that are. So anyone want to comment on that? Any questions, any initial first thoughts? We will obviously talk about this in more detail later.
Do these new releases generally come with a robust glossary defining each of these items?
So they've varied. I've only been through, this is my first really major release for fire, and I was surprised at how little they did. What the version 4 had was every resource had a really specific Delta document that showed this is what changed for this particular resource. And they technically have that, but they're using a third-party service. So what they're actually providing is a Delta of the web page of the documentation. And what they used to have was an actual listing of the substantive changes. And it's a lot harder to parse through what's changed on the documentation page than to just look at like the stuff that people need to care about. So I did I tried to take a look at patient, and it was just really difficult to parse. I couldn't tell without really focusing if there were any substantive changes to patient. So I decided to table it for now, because obviously we're going to want to look at certain things in more detail. But there was I actually even found it difficult to find anything about what was different. I finally found a history page that had some highlights of what changed from version 4 to version 5 on the HL7 site, but it took me a while. So I was pretty surprised at how little information was out there, not both generally in the industry, but also specifically on the FIRE website regarding what is a major new version. and how it changed. All right, let's move on for now. We'll talk about this more later. Excuse me. So ONC has released a fact sheet on the full EHI export. This is the last major piece of the original May 2020 interoperability rule to come into effect. Someone's going to point out something that I'm missing, but this is really the last big thing. And basically the requirement is that all certified health IT must both certify against full EHI support, meaning every piece of data that is effectively electronic data that's part of the designated record set. We've talked about the definition of EHI before. And not only does it have to be supported, but it has to be fully available to all customers by December 31st. This is something they did with the API support too. They didn't say this is the date you have to have it certified by, and then you can, you know, roll it out over time afterwards. What they specified actually was the date when things have to be both certified and widely available to all customers. And they did the same thing here. So what's interesting is that my recollection of this component was very focused on individual single patient EHI export. And that is definitely one of the things that is required. But there's also a patient population EHI export. So where physicians are supposed to be able to export everything for their patients. And it's not clear, I don't remember, and it wasn't covered in this document, if there are other criteria, like if they can slice that in other ways and define the patient population they're interested in. But I know that it definitely applies to these are my patients, give me their data. So this is not required to be FHIR. There are some people working on a FHIR version of this. But the requirements for the single patient are that the patient can export their own EHI whenever they want without getting assistance from a developer or someone else. So basically, they need to be able to push a button somewhere or do something on their own and have get the EHI without someone intervening in any way. It has to come in a timely fashion. They don't define that in any real sense, at least not here. It has to include all of the EHI for that patient. It has to be electronic and in a computable format. There has to be a publicly accessible link that defines the format that it's being exported in. So if you were to export everything in FHIR resources, you have to link to the FHIR resources that you're using. If you're using like CCDA, you have to link to CCDA. If you're using some random other format, you might have to include a data dictionary if it's not a well-known format, but you have to provide enough information that you can parse the data. And you have to be able to limit who can do it, by which I took that to mean you have to apply appropriate access control on the data. Not that you're limiting the patient's ability to get their own data, but that you're ensuring that other people can't get that patient's data just by requesting it. On the population front, it's pretty similar. It has to be all of the relevant EHI. It has to be electronic and computable. You have to provide information about the format. Let's go on to the next page and then I'll open it up. They did provide a couple of other specific comments about what you have to do or not do. So the file format, as I was mentioning before, it should describe the structure and syntax of how the EHI is exported, but the file format doesn't include any EHI itself. So that portion of it should be publicly available without there being any privacy issues. So that's basically the metadata saying this is how you interpret the rest of this message. One thing I found interesting is this is another one of the certifications that's based on attestation, and there's no testing requirements. I think that one's gonna. I think this one should have testing requirements, but they don't. So basically, all they have to do is attest to it. Presumably, for people who know what the rule is, if they're not being given access and their EHR or other technology has supposedly certified against this, there should be mechanisms for complaining about that. And presumably there would be a somewhat slow process for dealing with people who attest to things that are not actually happening. But I'm not a big fan of that as a process. But they also point out specifically that the EHI is not constrained to what's physically stored in certified health IT. So if you are certifying a particular product and there are components of that product that are not that are like modules or other components that are not part of the certification, all of the data stored in those modules has to be included in the EHI export. Also, if you are storing your data in the cloud or using some other mechanism that is outside of your product to store it, that doesn't matter. It's the data generated by the product, not the data stored in the product. So any questions about any of that? All right, let's move on to the next update then. So this is an exciting one. We know absolutely nothing about it. And actually, Nikki Tripathi teased it out after last night after I sent out the slides. So I think that means it's pretty imminent. But all we know about this rule is the title. And the title basically says that it has some health IT certification components, that it involves HIE attestations for TEFCA. There are those pesky attestations again, and some expansion or some change to information blocking. We don't know any details yet. That listing literally has the title. It shows that it passed the OMB on March 31st of this year. And like I said, Nikki tweeted it out late yesterday as a teaser. We already had found it, but so I suspect that means it's coming really soon. I don't know if anyone else has heard anything more about this, but that's all I know.
Presumably, Janice, this would be the notice, the NPRM for making sure that electronic medical records have capacities to support FHIR APIs for prior authorization, as an example. Am I correct?
Well, we have no idea if that's true or not.
Except when they say health IT certification, my antenna go up. So hopefully that's.
Yeah, we have no idea if this is something that comes from the RFI that was out last year, if this is something related to, something that, if it's a parallel to the CMS rule related to, prior auth provider access APIs. I mean, there are things that, there might be some certification components related to provider access APIs. There could be, there's a whole big thing on provider directory stuff happening. It could be related to no surprises. Who knows, right? There's literally no information available about what it is at this point.
VJ put up a link to.
I did see that. Thank you. I'm not sure if that's the page that I found or not. I'll look at it after the meeting, but thank you for that, VJ. So more to come on this, hopefully soon. Let's move on. Another ONC item. The high-tech annual report came out, so it was technically dated February 8th, but they just started advertising it. The ONC tends to have a delay between when some of these eventually public-facing reports are generated to when they're made public. To when they're advertised. It may have been public, but hidden. There's usually about a month and a half to 2 month delay, and that obviously was true here. So this is a really interesting report because it focuses on 5 separate target areas that high tech is, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's the group that does a lot of the interoperability work at ONC. The US CDI development happens under high tech, and
It's the Health Information Technology Advisory Committee.
Thank you.
David and I are one brain.
But basically, most of the decisions and work around interoperability that happens at ONC pass through high tech. And often a lot of the groundwork and spade work is done by high tech. So they have a report. They report on 5 different areas. What I found interesting in the way they phrased it, this is their phrasing for the 5 areas. So it's design and use of technology to advance health equity, but it's just use of technology to support public health. I did not see a real distinction in what they covered, so I'm vaguely curious about why they chose to talk about it that way. Then interoperability, privacy and security, and patient access. So what I have on this page and the next one is I've pulled out one-line portions of gaps that they identified in these areas. This actually comes from a long table, and each of these is around the table, and they talk about some of these have longer descriptions, they talk about them in some detail. They talk about some action items they might take. There are also some other components of the report. They talk about some of the activities that happened during 2022, a little bit in very general terms about future plans. It's a really interesting and useful report. I highly recommend it. There's a link on the next page. But just to give you some idea, I wanted to pull out some of the gaps because a lot of them are things we talk about, but some of them are things that we may not have in general. So I'm not going to necessarily read all of these, but they talk about inconsistent data collection. And one of the things I found interesting is, everyone talks about implicit bias in AI, but they extended the conversation and sort of had one item that encompassed both AI and CDS. And they are related, and some CDS tools use AI, so it's not like they're unrelated. But I thought it was interesting that they made that explicit expansion. When they talked about closed loop referrals, they also made it clear they were not talking solely about SCOH and social services, although that was indeed part of the issue, but also referrals within the healthcare system as well. And another one that they talked about, which is not necessarily something that we've talked about a lot, was that telehealth documentation isn't always integrated with the rest of the system. We talk about patient matching, we've talked about endpoints and having directories and all of that stuff. And that's something that we're looking at doing something about, actually. But let's go on to the next page and continue looking at some of the things that they pulled out before I open it up. That first one, obviously that's also something that is in the process of being fixed, although again, more on the CMS side. What I also found interesting, one of the other things I found really interesting is that when they talked about lack of standards around segregating sensitive health data, they did actually include more than the stuff that's technically considered sensitive data from a legal perspective. And they talked about women's health data. They talked about pediatric data. They talked about data around gender. So they were looking at the current social and political landscape and saying, well, we need to look at what we're doing about maternal health care data. We need to look at what we're doing about gender care and care for trans and non-binary and other care that is somewhat under attack in certain places, and how do we protect that data, make it more private, protect the patients who are getting that care. So I thought that was interesting because that was one of the first times where I've seen that formally done, even though obviously there's been a lot of discussion about the need for it. Another thing that they pointed out is that many of the providers that are adopting the APIs are very concerned about liability from them. And so that was interesting. And so at this point, if I remember correctly, what they were just looking to hold some more listening sessions to better understand what the concerns are. And some of that may be a lack of understanding how APIs work or just having to do something new. But that was something they pointed out. They also had a couple of places where they talked about consents. and how the industry advancement, one of the things here, which I agree with, and this sort of goes back to the conversation about women's healthcare, healthcare for gender diverse populations, et cetera, is that the industry advancement is outpacing regulations around consent and what requires consent and how consent should work. And, we've talked about this with SCOH. Right now, although there's no regulations that require exchange of US CDI version 2, at some point there will be. And at that point in time, there will be a legal mandate to exchange SCOH data, but that's data that, along with, that's another class of data that most patients, I know when we've talked about it, we've almost unanimously felt that should be protected at the same level as behavioral health data. And it's not right now. So there's lots of issues around consent, and so the industry is moving faster than consent can be considered. They did talk a bit about more research and guidance around mobile health apps, but for both effectiveness and data security and privacy issues. And again, there was a liability concern around patient-generated data, both in terms of deciding to rely on it and choosing not to use it when they have it. So there was concern about liability on both ends of that. So I thought that was interesting. And again, more transparency around both accuracy and patient consent. And the last thing that they talked about was the low level of compliance with price transparency rules and how user unfriendly sharing price data is right now and how that hinders patient access. And I found this one particularly interesting because there's a lot of pushback on certain groups of people working on no surprises related stuff to make it easier. They have a focus of making it easier to implement and easier to do, and not looking at what's easiest or best or makes the most sense from the patient perspective. And I know I attend calls sometimes where no surprises is discussed, where I push back and say, I understand that I understand what you're saying here. It is difficult. It is a logistical problem. It is more difficult to do this than some other things that you're doing now. But there is a reason that this was part of the law and part of what's being requested, and that's because this is what's needed to make it life useful and easier for the patient. For instance, there are people who suggest that anything that's covered by price transparency, hospital price transparency rules, not be required to be part of no surprises. I've heard that multiple times. And so the patient has multiple avenues that they have to use. And plus they're not getting as personalized or as specific. There are people who don't think patients should be able to shop because, if they should only have to do this once a service is scheduled, because it's easier to do once a service is scheduled. And so I think that's going to be a big push and pull moving forward with some of these things. Anyone want to comment on any of these? All right.
Well, the more progress we make, the more we uncover that has to be done. I mean, there are a lot of gaps here.
Indeed. And this is not every single thing that they listed. This is just, I pulled off, I'd say it's most of them. It's not 100%. This is a really interesting report. I definitely recommend it if you're interested in learning more. And again, each of these lines here is an entire row in a table with lots more data and information. And then there's other sections of the report as well. But let's move on for now. All right, so call for a pause on AI use. This has been in the news a lot lately, and it's really interesting because people are weighing in on both sides. For those of you who may not have heard, there's a group of tech experts that have called for a 6-month pause in AI development. And it's development on AI that is stronger than current AI to allow for regulations and laws to catch up. So it's not on using AI, on using existing models or even on developing things that are similar to what's already out there. And some of the things they call for totally make sense. You know, research focusing on making systems more accurate, safer, more transparency, you know, having provenance and watermarking of systems, knowing the full provenance of where the data came from and how it's being used and what the models are, and watermarking that this was legitimately run through this particular model and it isn't a fraud. Having, you know, some regulation, having oversight, those types of things. The thing that I don't call out on this slide, that one of the things that they talk about, sort of the underlying theme of why they're only calling for this on stuff that's stronger than what we have now, is they're kind of proposing that we're getting towards a point where AI, we're reaching sort of the more human-like AI state that is generally considered the stuff of science fiction. And so that's underlying a lot of what they say. So the stuff that they're calling for is not necessarily, it's stuff that a lot of people could agree with. And in fact, on the next slide, I actually present one of the rebuttals, and they say that we agree with several of the things that they suggest, but the premise of it is wrong. And so it's not, you know, it's like, if you're going to put a pause on everything, or it is one of the things. Some people think it should be longer. There's a lot of discussion. Let's go to the next slide. And, you know, so, you know, they talk about agreeing, and they think that the regulatory effort should, so this group that I highlight here with this other letter is a group, it's a smaller group of people, but they're very well known in AI. And they talk about transparency, accountability. The other thing that they raised in their letter, which was not part of the first letter at all, is exploitative labor practices that stem from AI. And they basically are taking, so they take issue with that premise that AI is going to be too powerful to control or be human competitive. And they thought that the original letter was looking too much at the long term, but there are actual issues that exist today that should be addressed. And so I think that most of people agree there are areas that some type of regulation, some type of oversight, the idea of provenance and watermarking seems to be pretty popular. So I think there's agreement on some of what people want to do, but not on the reasons for it and the approach, and not on this idea that the problem is stuff we haven't developed yet. There's problems with what we have right now. So you can find both of the letters I referenced there. And I don't know if anyone wants to comment on this issue.
Janice, I know that some healthcare AI leaders have convened and are due to publish a position paper about how AI can be more thoughtfully and you know, be managed and governed with a greater focus on transparency, accountability, and, as you point out, exploitative labor practices. But they're focused on healthcare. That probably is going to come out within the next week or two, at which point we could probably go over that with this group as soon as it's released. But it involves a number of leaders in healthcare, AI, and information technology. It'll probably give us a good sense of what people in the industry are thinking about what needs to be managed. Much similar to the work that John Halamka and Mayo did around the ingredient label,
list, right?
Yeah, things that give people a greater sense of what the algorithm does, what it doesn't do, where is its application likely to produce errors that are significant, where can it be used most effectively, what's being done to watermark or identify algorithms so people know what they're using in advance, things like that.
Yep. And actually, just to tie things back, another area that the ONC certification might be around is AI, because I attended a listening session where it was like 90 minutes, I think. The entire 90-minute session was ONC soliciting suggestions and thoughts on how we should govern AI and whether there should be regulation, whether they should consider regulation on AI. So that's another area they might be looking at as well. So, all right, well then let's move on and we'll talk about that when the healthcare specific report comes out. Just really quickly, a whole bunch of national payers have been working on reducing their prior authorization requirements. United Healthcare is the most recent one, and they're looking to do it later this year. But as part of this healthcare deep dive, sort of deeper look, when the United Healthcare announcement came out, they talked about what other national payers have been doing. And Cigna apparently has removed 500 requirements since 2020. Aetna's rolled back 10% and intends to do more this year. They did note that physicians feel like PA requirements have been increasing, but if you note the time frame, the physician data was 2020 to 2021. And while some of these rollbacks have started at that point, most of them have been more recent. So I think that may just be a time frame mismatch. But I don't know. I could be wrong. But there's sort of a check of this is what the payers say that they're doing, and this is how the physicians feel about it. So you can find more at that article. Any quick comments on that?
I think that what we hear from the trade associations, like the Medical Group Management Association, this is an intensely politicized issue. And most of the political language has been coming from the provider side, particularly the AMA, the MGMA, some from the hospital association at the national level, but not as much, as prior auth is not as big a hospital issue as it is a physician practice issue. But I've grown somewhat accustomed to looking at both industry announcements and trade association announcements with a grain of salt, because the reality is this is an issue that some of the recommendations that have come from the provider side are ones that anyone would largely agree from a practical perspective are not going to solve problems. But there's enough animus in the debate that one knowledgeable person I talked to about it said people want to see, blood on the ground. This is something they're very unhappy about. And to the point of arguing that it should go away completely, which makes sense in some respects until you ask the ACOs who are working with providers in their own organizations about how they manage utilization. And they need these kinds of PA requirements, and they need to have them in place. So, the work that we're doing is really trying to toe a middle line that automation is essential to have any clarity, to bring any clarity to this debate. And that there are things that health plans can do to simplify what is unnecessary complexity. And we would certainly like to convene the health plans and talk about that. We're working on that. It's not just a technology solution. There are some common sense changes that would make a big difference. But this is a very contentious issue. And I think one needs to have take a deep breath before diving into the pros and cons of it when articulated by trade associations and others.
But I think the other truth, Denny, is that if you look over a long enough time horizon, this has been a pendular topic for a few decades, right? Yeah.
It's been when it was called utilization review, or they feared it was economic credentialing. They came up with all sorts of terms for it. But there has to be a gating function, whatever we choose to call it. We can call it Fred, but there has to be a gating function, and getting clarity on it is harder to find when you read what the trade associations are saying. So
and I would just toss out there one more thing before we move on, which is that one area that where a lot of improvement could happen just is in the standardization of low-hanging fruit. And having some of the things that are more common have pretty standard requirements around whether PA is needed and what the requirements are for getting the PA. That's my 2 cents. But me, I'm always big on standardizing things.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. You'll pause there for a moment. I hope you learned a lot from our quick updates. If you're interested in finding out more about the DGC and its other activities, email me at dgc@myhealthdata.org. That email address is also on your screen right now.